Everyone. My name's Allie, and we're going to talk about a strategy or an approach I've been learning about for therapy, for counseling called motivational interviewing. And so I've been learning all about it for the past few weeks, and I'm really excited to share what I've been learning with you. All right, so our agenda for today, I'm going to give a quick introduction with an overview and a history of what motivational interviewing is. I'm going to talk about the theory of MI and what it actually says, as well as some of the information and strategies that are given about the how. We're going to talk about how it's related to other theories and approaches. Then we'll talk a little bit about what the research says. There's a ton of research, so we're not going to get to all of it, but we're going to talk about some of the highlights from the research. We're going to talk about how motivational interviewing fits with social work, principles, and ethics. Then we're going to talk about how I'm really excited to use motivational interviewing in practice. And then finally, I'll leave you all with some references and resources. All right, so a very quick overview of motivational interviewing. So motivational interviewing is essentially a conversation. The clinician is asking questions and engaging in a process to help the client explore their own feelings about change. So this especially addresses ambivalence and helps individuals resolve mixed feelings they have about their desire, their motivation, and commitment to change. It really starts from a place of assuming that clients, when they have a big change that they're considering or that they have to make, that they feel all sorts of different ways about it. It's designed to strengthen a client's own intrinsic motivation, their own internal sense of motivation and commitment to change. It really values and respects a client's own autonomy. It's really practical, collaborative. It's also very adaptive, and it comes out of a person-centered therapeutic method. So a lot of the skills and strategies are really aligned with what you'd see in other therapeutic interventions and approaches. Motivational interviewing is especially useful. I think this is good to know, like, when might you be considering using motivational interviewing as a strategy? So essentially, if you're thinking about different variables when you've assessed a client, if they're coming in and they are either in a sort of pre-contemplative or contemplative phase of change, they have an issue or concern in their life that there's really high importance, but there's a lot of ambivalence or a lot of mixed feelings. And at the same time, they're lacking some confidence that they will be able to make the change. They're feeling a little bit pessimistic, and motivation to make the change is not high, or at least the client is not able to articulate it or really varies in their level of motivation. There's different types of, clients can look different ways in that sort of pre-contemplative or the beginning of contemplative phase. They might be reluctant, so they're just not ready to make a change. They might be more rebellious, so like being hostile and resistant, and just absolutely not. But maybe there's some part of them that in fact is ready, or they're showing up in treatment for a reason. Some clients are sort of more resigned, so they appear more like they've given up, or they're more resistant to change. And then some clients are kind of what they call rationalizing. And so they look more like they're debating, like they have all the answers, and that looks more like almost like a lawyer arguing something out in the courtroom. And I did not make these up. These come from DiClemente and Velasquez, and they talk about the theory of change model and clients in that pre-contemplative phase. But there is a lot of writing that shows that clients who are in those phases, motivational interviewing can be very helpful for. All right, so a brief history of motivational interviewing. The founder is someone named William Miller, and he was working in addiction treatment, and he was working with folks who are obviously trying to address their substance use. And he was just seeing what worked. So this is really like a bottom-up type of approach, or it was developed in a bottom-up way, right? He didn't have this high-level theory, that high-level academic theory that then he tried to develop an approach that he thought would fit the theory. He was out working in the field. He was working in the field with his colleagues. He was talking to people who are struggling with addiction and recovery. And he was just noticing what worked, what clients responded to, how they responded to different types of interventions. And he started to write down his ideas. It's also just good to know that he had been really influenced by the work of Carl Rogers, so the work on empathy and therapeutic relationships. So those themes really are highlighted throughout all of his writing and all of the strategies that he talks about. And it makes motivational interviewing really well aligned with any other approaches or theories that sort of come out of that same tradition. So he wrote his ideas down. He first outlined them in the early 80s. So this is relatively new, but it's been around for a while. And the first draft that was published in 1983. Of course, at that point, there wasn't any evidence. It hadn't been studied yet, but it started to get disseminated as people started to learn about it. But then the first actual real comprehensive guide for the strategies, more details on how to do the interventions, didn't get published until 1991. So then that gets published from the early 90s or throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Miller continued writing about it. Like, it wasn't something that he just put out there and then it stayed static and has remained the same. He is still writing about it. He writes about it with a partner, and he has continued to articulate the spirit, the methods of motivational interviewing. And I think that's really great because it has adapted with the times. The more recent writings have taken into account the way the field has developed, the way other theories have developed. One challenge is that sometimes, because it is a live and adapting theory and approach, sometimes the terminology that is used in later writings is different than the terminology used in earlier writings. So as just one example of this, in early writing, he would he used the term more about resistance for clients who were talking in ways or behaving in ways that was not aligned with the change they wanted to make. And he changed that in later writings. He decided, like, that sounds a little too blamey. So he decided to use the term sustain. So that's just one example. But it's just good to know that the terminology is changing as he continues to publish and articulate it further. The other thing that has happened since it was published, and it's continuing to happen, is that motivational interviewing has just continued to be adapted for broader health and psychological context. So out of the substance use and addiction treatment field, it's now used in a lot of fields, especially where there's a behavioral component, I think is an important, some behavioral component, some type of change that needs to be made, especially when clients have something where clients may have felt misunderstood, and they may feel like they're being pressured to make changes that are difficult and ongoing. So another example of a field that it's used in a lot is eating disorders or suicidality. So anytime that there's like a cycle where the client might be feeling alienated, and then the clinicians might be feeling frustrated or disappointed because the client's not making changes, motivational interviewing can sort of be used to disrupt that cycle. And so that can be a lot of fields. It's not just mental health. It's been used a lot in healthcare fields, like physical healthcare fields, primary care, clients needing to make lifestyle changes for health, like smoking cessation, or being sort of following the treatment protocols they need to follow for something like cancer or diabetes. For dental care, I've read there's a lot of literature. People feel really ambivalent about their dental care, apparently. Okay, so then moving on, since the 90s, since it was published and since it started getting adapted for all these other contexts, that was happening really fast. At the same time, clinicians who were using it were starting to do studies, to hold trials, to study the efficacy, to see what worked, why it worked, how it worked. And so there's, at this point, thousands and thousands of trials in all of these different fields, and that is obviously still continuing. And then bringing up to current day, as I said, this is still being developed. This is living. Things are continuing to evolve. Miller is adding new For example, he added this like way of thinking about the different processes that are involved relatively recently. All right, that's like the super, super quickest overview, but let's get more into what the theory actually says. All right, so the descriptive theory, what's the problem? How does motivational interviewing see the problem? Essentially, they get right to it. They say that the heart of the quote unquote problem or reason that a client may not be able to make change on their own is that they're feeling unexamined ambivalence. So let's unpack what unexamined ambivalence means a little bit. Ambivalence means like the dictionary definition is feeling two ways about something, sort of being of two minds. A part of me feels this way, another part of me feels that way. But Miller and others talked about like that's really even usually an oversimplification. Often a client will feel multiple ways about an issue or a problem or a change that they're needing to make in their life. So essentially, this is feeling all mixed up about something. At least, I think Miller writes, they feel at least two ways about it. And then unexamined is just that they haven't been able to look at it for themselves. They haven't been able to articulate it for themselves. And so because they can't do that, they feel they haven't been able to like really think about their values and their goals and their motivation. So because they haven't been able to like examine that ambivalence, they're just sitting with feeling all mixed up about something. And that feels uncomfortable. They feel discomfort. Um, we as humans just don't like it when there's this huge unresolved tension. It's why movies are so satisfying to watch because the tension usually gets resolved at the end. It feels uncomfortable until there's that resolution. So they're feeling discomfort with that ambivalence. So what do we do? We avoid. We just like, okay, that situation, that thing I have to change, that's a whole mess. I'm just not going to think about it, or I feel frozen. I'm gonna distract myself. I'm gonna maybe continue to engage in this behavior if it helps me forget about it. So something like substance abuse, they might say, gosh, I can't even think about like this discomfort. Um, this feels so uncomfortable. Maybe this strategy for not thinking about it is really helpful. So there's going to be some element of avoidance. And what that looks like is staying stuck. Staying stuck is not making a change um, in any direction. So not moving towards a change or accepting current circumstances and just coming to a place of acceptance around that. Doing neither of those, not making a plan, just staying stuck. And that can be frustrating for everyone. That's frustrating for the client, the person with the issue. Miller and others talk about the fact that and acknowledge the fact that that can be really frustrating for the client's sort of natural support system, whether that's family, friends, colleagues. And it can be frustrating for any clinicians that they're involved with. So really that ambivalence and that unexamined ambivalence is the primary target. Okay, so we've talked about the problem, so what's the solution? And Miller is really clear that the solution is not just a clinician coming in and telling the client what the problem is and what they should do, and here's how you should fix it. It's essentially the opposite of that. So the strategy, the like overall prescriptive theory is that you're exploring and with the client and helping them resolve their ambivalence, again, in some direction. And it's agnostic on what direction things get resolved in, right? It may be making a big life change or committing to recovery or committing to a new set of behaviors. But it may also be accepting that, like coming to a place of acceptance that a client, for the client themselves, that they're not able to do that. But the way you get there then is to identify what the client's true goals and values are. And so that has some overlap there with ACT, which we can talk about later. But identifying the client's own, and again, this is not the clinician's, but the client's own, what their internal goals and values are, sort of a key starting point to exploring the ambivalence, helping the client develop motivation, their own sense of motivation and being able to articulate themselves, And then if a clinician's able to help a client with that, it can ultimately move to developing a plan and committing to a plan. Although the planning and committing to a plan, Miller says that they may not always happen. It depends on how brief the intervention is or engagement is, but they can be part of the process. And how do clinicians do that at a high level? Again, they're using the sort of client-centered, humanistic listening and reflection. They're taking a stance of acceptance and non-judgment. Miller's really clear that acceptance is what helps make change. So acceptance of where the client is, the client accepting for themselves, accepting what their circumstances are. Again, this has some overlap with ACT principles, I think. The clinician really never taking on a stance of judgment, because you don't want to get that cycle of alienation and frustration going. Just being very understanding of where the client is, why change is hard to make, because that's human, and probably the clinician can really relate to that in their own life. So those things I think are really, again, there's a lot of overlap with other sort of humanistic, client-centered type approaches. Where it gets a little bit more motivational interviewing specific is this idea of eliciting and attending to change talk. So change talk, that terminology is something that's more specific to motivational interviewing, and that's anytime a client is talking about the advantages of change, the disadvantages of staying the same, basically their own motivation for changing, their hopefully optimism for changing, and their strategies for a client or for a clinician to really be on the lookout for that type of talk, ways to actively sort of elicit it and evoke it in clients, and to help clients sort of make their own narrative of that. And we'll talk more about those really specific strategies in a bit. And then overall, just being a collaborative guide to clients throughout this whole process. Okay, so that is, I know it wasn't super brief, but it was the briefest sort of high-level overview I could give. So now, as I said, this is very motivational interviewing. I like it because it's very adaptable. There is a lot of guidance, but it's not overly manualized. The downside of that is I think that sometimes there's components and there's principles and strategies and processes and skills that are laid out and provided in the literature. And sometimes there's overlap in them, or it's sort of not clear how things fit together and where. So I'm going to do my best to sort of lay out the landscape for us, starting with these 4 general principles. And this is what Miller calls the spirit of MI. So I think it's really important to start here, because it really gives the grounding, sort of a philosophical grounding for the more specific things like skills and processes. So the first general principle is expressing empathy. Again, from the clinician's point of view, just being really understanding of where the client's at. Miller writes a lot about how acceptance is the only way to change, and that includes the clinician's acceptance of where the client is, the client's own acceptance of their life circumstances, and just the reality of what they're dealing with. The clinician's doing reflective listening. They're also really, really, really normalizing when they're expressing empathy. They're normalizing that feeling ambivalence about issues, about changes that need to be made. That's normal. That is human. Everyone has felt that way. Everyone does feel that way. People feel mixed up about all kinds of things in their lives, even things that they think they shouldn't feel mixed up about. A lot of times clients have shame for feeling ambivalent about something where they know what the quote unquote right answer is, right? They know that they should want to quit smoking if they're having lung issues, or they know that they should want to stop drinking if they recently had a DUI or their marriage is in trouble. But life isn't that simple, and they have reasons why they've been using those strategies. And so just normalizing that and helping reduce some of that shame that leads to the discomfort that keeps you stuck, that's a key part of that expressing empathy principle. The next one is called developing discrepancy, and I love this one. This one really is, so you've helped a client identify, there's been like a conversation between the clinician and the client where you've been able to identify what the client's own goals and values are. So that's sort of the first part. And then Miller writes that what is really motivating for a client and what really can build internal motivation is a client themselves being able to see how whatever their current behavior is, when that's not aligned with what their ultimate goal or value is, that's motivating. So, and that is internally motivating in a way that comes only from the client. And at that point, if you're able to help a client develop a sense of discrepancy, then they can basically make their own argument for change to themselves. So an example of that might be if a client says, wow, my number one value, like the North Star in my life is my children, being present for my children, being a parent. I love that so much. Then seeing the ways in which continuing to use substances or continuing to drink, but when I continue, like when I wake up in the morning and I'm hungover and I can't make my kids breakfast, and that feels really bad, and I haven't been showing up for their school events, and I might even potentially lose custody because of my drinking. But when all I really want on this planet is to be a good parent for my kids, that is so helpful for a client, and it's something that they can refer back to. They can like hold that with them throughout the process and throughout their life, right? If they're like looking at a behavior or considering a behavior or potentially even on the edge of a relapse, if they can again look to that North Star in their life and see how the behavior that they're considering is sort of has a discrepancy with that can be really effective. The next principle is called rolling with resistance. And so I use this little, I don't know if you can see, but this little icon here is like people engaged in like judo or martial arts. And this is a metaphor that Miller uses. He talks about how like the more a clinician is coming in with an argumentative stance, being really oppositional to whatever a client says, or trying to really sort of push back, that's going to engage the client to be oppositional and push back and be more resistant to change. And so that is a dynamic that can get really entrenched, right? You can just be two people pushing against each other and not going anywhere. Miller talks about this being like a dance or working with the energy in the room. So you're going to roll with that resistance. And there's different strategies to do that. But just to remember to not, if you're finding yourself, if you're doing motivational interviewing or even other approaches and you're finding yourself just arguing with the client, that's a signal to take a step back. The other thing that Miller points out that I think is important about resistance is that it shouldn't just be ignored. It's a signal. Like if in this process, the clinician is really realizing that like, okay, a lot of resistance talk is happening. So the client is talking a lot about their pessimism for change, a lot about the disadvantages of changing or the advantages of staying the same. Then that's a signal to the clinician that maybe you need to revisit what the client's real goals and values actually are. Maybe there's another sort of side of the ambivalence that needs to be explored a little bit more. Maybe they're feeling misunderstood. Maybe, what's going on? It's a signal to take a step back, to sort of for the clinician to guide the client then and like re-looking at the landscape, but not to just get really entrenched in that fight. And then the final core principle is that this is all about self-efficacy. And that comes down to essentially really recognizing how important it is that the client believes in their own ability to change, and knowing that helping the client see that they have the skills and ability to make a change for themselves, and that's all internal to them. That there's not that's not going to come externally. Obviously, we live in a society, we live in a capitalist society. Like there's some maybe elements of a problem that a client can't change. It's like the serenity prayer, right? Like, help me accept the things I cannot change, but the courage to change the things I can. And so feeling that internalized, like being able to change the things I can, and the client really having confidence and motivation to do that for themselves. However, I like that Miller doesn't present that, because I think that's true. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the serenity prayer. Miller also talks about the fact, though, it's not really a bootstrappy type of approach. Like, it doesn't get into that neoliberal bootstrappy type of world, where the client's just, so do it yourself then. Miller also talks a lot about the relationship between the clinician and the client and how supportive that is, even to the point where he says that, like, when there's moments when the clients can't hold on to hope and motivation and belief for themselves, that the clinician's own belief and confidence in their client is also really important and supportive. So it does get at the fact that humans are interconnected and looking for relationships. And so even though ultimately the client is the only person who can make the changes to their behaviors that they need to make, they do have support, and that this is a very supportive relational type of engagement. Another way that some of the literature breaks down the core components of motivational interviewing is talking about different processes that happen throughout any type of intervention or treatment. And so some of these overlap a little bit with the principles that we've talked about, as well as the skills that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these, but I just want to lay them out because I think they are helpful for conceptualizing. And there's some stuff that's touched on here that isn't touched on in as many other places. So the first one is engaging. Again, this is really getting at that humanistic, client-centered, doing reflective, active listening, building rapport, demonstrating empathy. This looks a lot like other sort of talk therapy, humanistic talk therapy type approaches. The next one is a focusing. This is a little bit more motivational interviewing centered. So this is, Miller writes that it's like a negotiation between the client and the clinician. And this is sort of where they are negotiating an agenda for what their focus in treatment is going to be like. And so there might be different focuses at different points if it's a longer term treatment. But it is a way of essentially getting the clinician, getting some consent from the client that, they might be working together in the context of a substance abuse treatment center, but really like getting that buy-in, getting a common understanding. It's sort of like getting a roadmap of like, okay, so we're working on stopping or decreasing substance use together. Like that's what we're focusing on. That's what we want to work towards. Evoking is this sort of conversational back and forth. It's not just asking questions. There's also reflective listening and summarizing, and attending to that change talk, which we'll get to in a moment. That's also very motivational interviewing specific. I think when a lot of people think about motivational interviewing, certainly when I did, that's sort of what they are thinking about. That's the thing that I think is most unique about it. It's a place where there are really specific strategies and types of questions you can ask and ways that you reflect. And then the final stage is planning. Again, Miller writes that the planning and like really making a more specific plan for change, that might not happen in every course of treatment. There has to be time for it. A client has to get to the point where they are ready to do that. But if it's possible, then that is definitely something the clinician can help the client with. And you'll see down at the bottom of this image, you'll see how there's this like arrow that goes back and forth. And that's because even though these are sort of laid out in a sequential plan, like a client or a sequential order, the first thing you do with a client when you meet them from the first session is that engaging, building rapport, and then planning is something that's going to happen much later. they're not discrete phases like, okay, you engage and then you focus and then you evoke and then you plan. You may have to circle back to focusing, for example, if you're doing some evoking, doing some change talk, and you realize that, actually our goals or values may not be, we might not be focusing on the same thing. You may need to circle back. You're doing engaging throughout, like any of this, even when you're to the phase of planning, you're still going to be doing engaging, engaging with the client, building some rapport. So just to say that they're not really discrete phases, I think is important. Okay. So, and again, like I said, there are some overlaps here, but another way that the core components are laid out is in terms of skills. And these are like more specific ways that you can work through the phases and actually implement those general principles. And I think a lot of people have heard the acronym OARS, OARS, which is for these first 4 skills that are listed. And these especially, they're used throughout, but they really especially go with that evoke phase, I think. So the first one is asking open questions. We know what an open question is. It's a question for which there isn't a yes or no answer. And helping the client to reflect on things in their own terms. The next skill is affirming and showing acceptance. And so this is really also, this is part of rapport and engagement. Miller specifies that one of the ideas here is to focus on the client's strengths. So strengths-based, recognize ways that they, in fact, are putting in effort, that they are trying hard, that they are resilient. That is a lot of what comes into affirming. The next one, and this is really, I gotta say, this is one of the areas that I think I learned the most, was reading about the importance of reflecting in motivational interviewing. One misconception that I had before diving into the research is that you're doing a lot more focusing, or a lot more focus on those open-ended questions, that it was more, it's in the name, it's motivational interviewing. I think of interviewing as asking a lot of questions, and I had heard and read about some of the questions that you ask. But Miller is really clear and does a lot of writing that actually a clinician, especially a skilled clinician, the bulk of a motivational interviewing session is in fact not asking open questions. If the clinician is just asking question after question, the clinician is then first of all, they're taking a more active stance than the client. It can feel a little bit alienating for the client. And it doesn't give the client a chance to really create their own narrative or take stock of where they are or develop that discrepancy for themselves. So that is where that's where reflecting comes in. So reflecting is essentially the clinician repeating back to the client, well, not repeating, reflecting. They are taking in what a client's telling them and reflecting it back, not directly. So they're not going to parrot it back word for word. What they're going to do is they're going to try to get to the underlying meaning of what the client just said, and reflect it back to the client, and see if they understood it. So for example, a client might come into the office and say, oh my God, let's say they're at a residential treatment center. Like, I'm so done with this treatment. I've been here forever. I'm over it. Like, this sucks. And a clinician might say, you're really frustrated and with how long this is taking, and you were hoping to feel better by now. And if they got that wrong, they would invite the client to let them know that they got that wrong. But reflecting back as a way of helping consolidate and build a narrative is really critical for motivational interviewing. And I think, and Miller says this too, and I can see as someone who's just still in training, who's still learning, that being able to do that skillfully is actually harder than the open-ended question process, because you really have to be able to understand the unstated meaning in what a client is saying and be able to capture that in words. Then there's summarizing, which is similar to reflecting, but it happens essentially less frequently, it's sort of a moment of pressing pause, taking stock of the bigger picture of where are we, what does this landscape look like, what is this map, if we were mapping out your ambivalence and all the different ways you feel about this and where your motivation's at, what does that map look like at this moment in time? And that's so you're summing up key issues, you're summing up the discrepancies maybe that you've been developed, and just sort of then the client and the clinician are on the same page. And so that sort of happens at moments, key moments throughout the process. And then finally, the skill of attending to change and sustain talk, of eliciting it. And that's another skill that, again, there's very specific strategies to, but helping the client just talk about their own ideas about change. All right, let's talk about this idea of building motivation for change, of eliciting and evoking change talk. All right, so these are some of the methods. So this is like, now we're getting really specific. Like there's actually suggestions of questions you can ask or things you can say in a therapy session in the literature about motivational interviewing. So the first one is asking questions that evoke different types of change talk. So you want the client to be talking about disadvantages of the current behavior situation, advantages of change. You want them to be talking about their optimism for change, and you want them to be talking about their intention to make change. So examples of questions that you can ask are, what worries of you about your current situation? What would be good things about making this change? If you did decide to make this change, what might work? What might you be willing to try? Another type of question you can ask or tool you can use is what they call the importance ruler. So you might say, and this also can help, this helps with like just clarification. So you might say, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is like not at all, and 10 is yes, totally all the way, how willing are you to make this change right now? And so you might say, how willing are you to start walking every day for a client who really has been told that they need to increase exercise for health reasons? And if the client says, I don't know, 3. Okay, so now you know sort of where they're at currently, but then you can also follow that up with, okay, so you're at a 3. Why are you at a 3 and not a 0? And that can help a client like really think about the fact that like there is some part of them that does want to make this change, and why do they want to make that change? Why reflect on the fact that they're not at a 0? And then you can also ask, so what would it take to help you get to a 7? Right? So that's the importance ruler, and you can kind of revisit that at different moments. It's also a good way to check in on where they're doing when you're doing that at those sort of summarizing transition points. Another method that they talk about is focusing on extremes. So like the best and the worst things that could happen. So you could say like, what's the best outcome you can possibly think of if you do make this change? Or if you don't make this change, like let's talk worst case scenario. What could happen? What concerns you most about your current challenge or problem? Another place to focus, again, is on goals and values. So I use the language of North Star, which I really like. What's your highest goal or value? How does your behavior fit with this value? This is going to help, again, this is sort of specific to that developing discrepancy principle. And then another sort of broad strategy is called looking back and looking forward. So helping the client look at the past, what was your life like before you started this behavior, but also helping them look forward. So if you did decide to change, what would you want? What do you think your life would be like in 10 years? What if you don't change? How would you like things to be different in the future? The literature around motivational interviewing also gives us these sort of more specific methods for responding to resistance talk or sustained talk. So this is when a client is talking in sort of more pessimistic ways about changing. So the first method is called sort of reframing. And this actually can be often getting really at that affirmation and empathy, and focusing on client strength. So a client might say, I've tried so many times to make this change and I failed and I don't even know what the point is. And the clinician might reframe that as, you've been so persistent and resilient, even when it's hard. So this must be really important for you to stick with, because you are working so hard, even though there have been times when it hasn't gone the way you've wanted. So that's a reframing from, I've tried and I've failed, to, you're persistent and you're resilient. Another one, and this also I think is really interesting, this gets at the principle of rolling with resistance, is accepting the resistance when it comes up. So a client says, this isn't going to work, it's hopeless. And instead of trying to like hype them up and say, no, it's not, you can do it, the clinician says, well, yeah, it's possible. You may try and it might not work. I know you've tried before, you're frustrated it hasn't worked before. So this time might be the same. You might try to make this change and you might not be any better off than you are now. So, maybe you're right. Maybe it's better not to try again. What do you think about that? And then, so that can also sort of be related to the like querying the future. Like, yeah, so what would happen if you just decide, nah, I'm not going to change? And then you explore it, and you have to honestly explore it. It has to be like a good faith exploration, right? You're not trying to trick the client. It's not intended to be a gotcha. It's just a really good faith, mutual, collaborative exploration. Another example is a client might say like, okay, you know what? Like, I know I'm here, but the drinking, it's just not that big of a problem for me. It's not that big of a deal. Everyone's making it into this huge thing, but it's not a problem. And the clinician might say something like, yeah, that might be true. I know you're here because it does cause some problems. I know you got your license taken away, but it's also a coping strategy you've been using. So maybe it's just worth that cost to you. What do you think about that? And then you explore from there. Another strategy, and this also gets at the client's self-autonomy, is just really emphasizing throughout that the fact that the client's in charge, they have choice, they have control. So a clinician might say things like, I'm just providing you information, but what you do with it is up to you. I can't make the decision for you. And it can also be affirming. The clinician can say things like, you have the choice to be here. And or maybe a client doesn't have a choice to be there because maybe they're court mandated, but you have the choice to like engage in this process with me, and to work with me, and you're making the effort, and I really appreciate that. So again, you're emphasizing the places. Client may not have control over every aspect of a problem, but the clinician is emphasizing the places where they do have choice and control. Then the next sort of, and this gets into more of that, the phase that's about planning and making commitment to change. So this, again, may not always happen, but when you have time and a client is ready to, it's a nice sort of way to wrap up. Miller talks about making sure to really summarize that, to like have a careful transition. If you're moving more from that change talk phase, to make the transition, the clinician wants to be very careful to do some summarizing that landscape of client ambivalence and goals, to like map that all out, make sure that there is a narrative that makes sense for the client. And so then once you've done that, then you start to like talk more specifically about options for how a client might be able to reach their goals. One thing in helping them think about strategies or options is to share from the clinician, here's what's worked best for others. And then ask, like, how do you think those would work for you? What do you think might work best for you? And then using that to, from there, sort of coming to more of a plan. And then the very final stage is trying to elicit the client's own commitment for that plan. And Miller recommends that the clinician ask really directly, is this what you want to do? And if they affirm that it is, they're at a moment of feeling real and an internal sense of commitment, they've resolved some of that ambivalence. They want to move forward. They want to take on new behaviors or new way of thinking. That's amazing. And then you also encourage them to, even though there's this principle of self-efficacy and that the client is the one that can make changes, because it's relational, it's not just relational with the therapist or the clinician. So the clinician also then really encourages the client to share that commitment with others in their life. So with friends, family, support groups. And another just key point is that not to push for that commitment. I think Miller writes a lot about how it can be tempting to find a moment where the client is starting to make change talk and then jump on it and really push for that commitment right away. But you have to be skillful and recognize if the client is in fact ready, and not pushing for commitment too soon can really be counterproductive. And then you can get more entrenched in that avoidance or argumentation, and then you're off track. So it takes a really skillful clinician to recognize the moment when you can have some more specific commitment talk. So some questions that clinicians can ask when they're in sort of the planning and commitment phase, like talking about what are the next steps, what are we going to do? Some suggestions are, so what changes, if any, are you thinking about making? What are your options? Where do we go from here? It sounds like things can't stay the way they are now. Sounds like this is not working for you. What do you think you should do? And this final one I love, because this one I think really draws on the client's creativity and imagination. And it asks, okay, if you were going to take the next step, we're considering taking the next step. If you were going to take the next step here, what would that look like? What would you do? And so you're not telling the client, you have to do this next thing, or what are you going to do next? Because that could be threatening. It could feel intimidating. It's helping the client just think through, what might that look like? Or you could ask, if you were talking to a friend and they wanted to make this change, what might you recommend for them, right? It's helping envision what the client might do in a world where they're ready to make this commitment. So I really like that one. Okay, so I know that was a lot of content, very heavy on the methods and the specifics. I'm going to zoom out for a moment and talk about the therapeutic relationship and motivational interviewing. So Miller writes that the relationship is necessary for change. It's not sufficient on its own for change, but it is really necessary. And he says that the strength of the alliance is predictive of better outcomes. And this has been well documented in the literature for all kinds of approaches, but it's true here in motivational interviewing as well. The motivational interviewing just takes the next step and says that a relationship on its own can't always actually help clients make real practical changes in their life. But again, it does stress empathy, acceptance, non-judgment. It says that those are really crucial. There's a sense of being collaboration, not adversarial. He writes about evocation over installation. So pulling out, drawing out from what's already within the client, rather than just putting a bunch of information and the clinician's own agenda on the client. And again, this point that whenever the client is expressing the sustain or resistance talk, if the clinician is able to meet them with empathy and acceptance and non-judgment, in fact, the client's actually more likely to move towards change talk. So it's harder to push back against an accepting and flexible stance. One of the things that Miller writes as sort of a phrase to articulate that stance also comes out of a 12-step tradition of take what makes sense to you and leave the rest, right? That's really hard to push back against. It's very flexible. So I think that's helpful to keep in mind. I use this image of a dance here because he describes the relationship as essentially a dance between the clinician and client. Okay, so how does this relate to other theories? So we've talked a lot about the ways that this is client-centered and humanistic approaches. Miller was influenced by Rogers and shares that relationship focus. It's aligned with, and some of the later writings incorporate the sort of trans theoretical stages of change. So those pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, relapse. And there's writings that talk about how to work with motivational interviewing at different stages of change. It's also obviously, because it's focusing on behavioral theories, and interventions. It's aligned with behavioral theories, because it's focused on making behavioral changes. It has some alignment with behavioral theories like social learning theory or behavioral activation. It just is all of Miller's writings and other writings about it really have the emphasis on being non-coercive about helping clients make change. So it should never feel imposed on a client or like they are in any way being controlled. It's often used as a brief solutions-focused intervention, so it can be very brief. Like this process can all be condensed and can be very brief, but it also works in longer-term therapeutic engagements. It also just integrates really well with a number of other theories and approaches. I've talked already about some of the ways that I think it's particularly well aligned with ACT, and I can see that a clinician who uses ACT that they could strengthen each other. So bringing in some of the mindfulness work from ACT, I think could help clients feel more comfortable with that ambivalence. They both share a stance of working towards acceptance, because acceptance is actually the place from which change can happen. It's also often integrated with CBT and DBT, which are certainly more structured. But there are clinicians who work and use and integrate both, and that happens pretty frequently from what I can tell from the literature. The research has found that motivational interviewing is actually more effective, and it increases the effectiveness of other approaches if it's used as sort of a pre-treatment or something that is used as like an adjunctive treatment to other approaches. All right, so then let's dive into a little bit more about the research. What does the research say? So, okay, there's thousands of studies. They take place in a wide variety of settings, of contexts, of populations. It's been studied for over 30 years at this point. And meta-analyses have found that, so looking at all of the studies that have been done, have found that there is empirical evidence that it is that's statistically significant, that it provides or that it's more efficient, or that it is efficient, I guess I should say, that it can provide benefits to clients, and that there is a durable benefit, and that it's more effective than some other similar approaches in some contexts. So overall, it's good to know that there is evidence that this works. It can be more effective than other approaches, and that it provides some lasting and durable benefit. That said, there's also a systemic review of reviews. So that was like looking at all the studies, including the meta-analyses that have been published. And what they did is they said that, yes, there is evidence that it's effective. There's actually a lot of evidence that it's effective, but that some of that evidence isn't super high quality. So that is good to know too. And that just points to the authors of that study just pointed to the need for more high quality research. And again, as I said, one of the, I think, key findings that's good to keep in mind is that it's even more effective when it's used alongside other approaches. The motivational interviewing is more effective, but also the other approaches are more effective. And this little graphic here just shows, this is a map from that review of reviews that shows the studies that were taken into account and all of the different domains that motivational interviewing has been studied in. So some of those research gaps that have been identified, basically that need for more high quality research. So more methodological rigor, more monitoring of like the fidelity of the application of motivational interviewing, which I think part of the reason, honestly, that hasn't been done is because it's not overly prescriptive and it is so flexible and adaptable. So looking at the fidelity can be of motivational interviewing can be more challenging than something that is very highly manualized. Doing more longitudinal assessments and more just overall comprehensive reporting in research. Other topics that have been noted that maybe need more research are the mechanisms for how it works and sort of causal pathways. There's always a need for more context-specific evidence of effectiveness in different populations, on different issues and different settings. That is being done, but just because it is so widely used, it's hard, I think, for the research and the evidence to keep up with the many ways in which it has been adapted. And then also just thinking about long term, like how can it be effective over the long term? And also one of the things that has been specifically called out is how can clinicians who've been trained in motivational interviewing, how can they stay proficient and effective over the long term? How can they stay up to date? There's not a lot of research around that currently. Okay, how does given all of that information, how does motivational interviewing fit with social work values? I think that motivational interviewing, this is something that Miller's laid out, and he talks about things that motivational interviewing is and is not. So motivational interviewing is collaborative, not confrontation. It's evoking, it's pulling out of the client. It's not education, so putting on the client, and it respects the client's autonomy. It's not about the authority of the clinician. And I think that maps really well with the values and ethics of social work. Other things that they have in common are just the collaborative and partnership focus on integrity and competence of the clinician. It's also motivational interviewing because it's so adaptable and flexible. It can be adapted and has been adapted in ways that are really respectful to cultural and individual nuances and preferences, ways of talking. It just can be adapted to working with almost any population. So I think all of those things really fit incredibly well with social work. I think one place that maybe there's a little bit of divergence, and I think this is oversimplifying it a bit, is that motivational interviewing, it is by its nature, it's focused on individual behavior, which social work can be as well. But it does have a little bit of a narrower focus on the individual, whereas social work broadly as a field, right, there's always a focus on systems and the person and environment, the broader context. And motivational interviewing isn't like, it doesn't ignore that, right? It acknowledges that there's parts of the client's world, their environment, that they may not be able to change, right? That like, that they might need to recognize, like in the Serenity Prayer, that there's things that they can't change and that that's part of the context. But it's still, just by its nature, is focused more on the individual, whereas I think the broader social work theory and values are really looking at the broader, or keeping in mind the broader systems and environment that the client is living in. There's nothing preventing a clinician using motivational interviewing from a social work perspective to make very explicit references to those systems in working with a client, but it's just something that isn't mentioned as much in the literature. All right, so how would I use motivational interviewing in my practice, or how am I using it? So currently I'm working at a respite, mental health crisis services community respite. So it's an alternative to hospitalization. So I'm already using it, from what I've learned, helping clients work to identify their goals and values that are meaningful with them. I led a group actually that did some of this, integrated with ACT values work, supporting clients in making commitments for actions that are supportive of their goals and values. So examples like changing behaviors around substance use, or really building up their own internal motivation for committing to treatment for substance use. Clients, I think this comes up the most in the level of care or the setting that I'm currently in. So they're at this respite setting. It's short term. So nearly all of our clients are going to need to, and they landed at respite because they're in some type of mental health crisis. So nearly all clients are going to have to change the level of mental health support that they're receiving. So they might make a decision to move. They've been living independently in say an apartment, but maybe they're realizing that they would do better, or they're being asked to consider moving to a group home, or in fact, they do actually need a higher level of care. They need to go inpatient, and that is a place, or they need to move to a sober living facility. That's a place where that's very scary to consider, and clients I think often feel stuck, and just afraid. And so using some of these strategies to help them consider the different ways that they're feeling about it, the pros and cons, what's important to them, how they might like to move forward, and what they think is most aligned with their own goals and values for themselves, is a place where I've already started to use this, and I think this could be really helpful for a lot of the clients that I work with. And then other things that clients sometimes want to do just in the very short term while they're at respite, that they sort of part of them wants to do and part of them doesn't want to do, is like engaging with peer support or in the community, engaging with staff, or building structure into their day. Those are relatively small things that they kind of think that they should do, but they're not, or have been told that they should do, but they're not totally motivated and able to do. So I think motivational interviewing can be helpful with that. Building some of these conversational strategies into my case management check-ins that are happening. I'm also, many of our clients have sort of slower processing speeds, or lowered cognitive abilities that have been lowered by substance abuse or brain injury. And so considering the ways that some of these conversational strategies can be adapted for their needs, I think is going to be really interesting to consider. And then also experimenting with using these strategies in like occasional groups. And these groups, again, are like, they're transdiagnostic. There's folks with a lot of different presenting problems and diagnoses, but considering how some of these conversational strategies can be adapted to working with them in a group. All right, so what am I excited about for the future? One of the things that I think is really interesting to consider is sort of thinking through more about how this could be integrated with internal family systems or ego states work. I think this is a pretty natural fit, right? Like when you're talking about ambivalence, like part of me wants this, another part of me wants this. In the future, I'm interested in working with parents who are struggling to who are grappling with how they parent. And I think it could be really helpful in supporting parents specifically who might be making changes to their parenting strategies or the ways they engage with their kids. I'm interested in using this again in groups. And I also think that it could be helpful for patients or clients who are facing serious illnesses, like cancer, where there's a lot of different treatment options, or are undergoing palliative care or in hospice, who are making end-of-life decisions. And there is some literature around the use of that, but it's something that I'd be really excited to dive into more. Okay, and so that wraps things up. There are some resources here. So there's this brief, and there's a ton of literature, but some free, easily available resources. There's this, the APA has this free PDF guide that's a much briefer guide than like a big, thick textbook, that gets really right to the heart of some of the core components and strategies. There's also an organization called the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers page. Those are trainers who are certified, officially certified in training on motivational interviewing, and they have a whole page of resources. So that's linked here. And then this final thing is something that I can't do here by myself. This is a quick demonstration of what this looks like in practice. So it's like a role play between a client and a clinician from psychotherapy.net. And there's a lot more of these available with a quick search on YouTube. So I think that can be really helpful for like conceptualizing what this looks like in practice. And then finally, references. These ideas are not my own. These all come out of the literature that I've been reading, especially Miller's own writing. And I've just tried to reflect them back here as much as I can. So this is a list of references and things that I read as I was putting this training together. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about motivational interviewing and what I've learned. And I hope that you're curious and interested too. Bye.